Hey students, this is Dr. Miller and this is your feedback for assignment number 5. This is by far the most technical and therefore most difficult assignment. But again, the way this class is set up, and this is largely because you have so many different cameras, pretty much if you turned in your assignments up till now on time, you get the full 25 points credit just because you're making the effort to complete the assignment. From this point forward, we're going to do things a little different, but more about that later. First off, let's talk about ISO. Remember, ISO is the sensitivity that you can set on cameras. And the sensitivity with ISO is measured from low numbers to high numbers, and more sophisticated cameras have a greater range of this. But here's the thing, when you're telling your camera to be more sensitive, in other words, to process light because it's not as prevalent in a certain shooting situation, you're also doing something else. You're introducing some noise, signal noise, degradation, whatever you want to call it. It's an effect that happens and it's not necessarily a good one. But I wanted to show you in this assignment what the difference is between using a low ISO. And so here we have a photograph from Landon Brooks, and I really very much like how he set this up with the Coke can here on the road. Now, this is information that comes from Landon's camera, and it is because Landon puts this image and other images that he's taken for the class on Flickr that I can go and I can look and see what settings were used. Now you should tell me for each photograph what settings you're using in terms of the f-stop, in terms of your lens that you're using. If you're using a zoom lens, for example, and this is a zoom lens, so he had it set at 42 millimeters. Which is slightly less than the standard that our eye sees. And this is the shutter speed, which is 1/15, which is pretty slow. And right here, we have the ISO setting. So for this particular shot, he's trying to show a low ISO setting. So there's 100. That's pretty low ISO. Now, I've asked you to take the same photograph again with a high setting. So here's essentially the same photograph again, but this time we have an ISO of 1600, considerably different from 100. So he's told his camera for this to be 16 times more sensitive. So is there a difference between the two shots? It's pretty subtle, isn't it? But if you take them and enlarge them and put them side by side, here's the 100 ISO shot and here's the 1600. It's pretty subtle, but you can see that there's a little bit of a difference in terms of the quality of the lines and the colors and the images. So 1600 ISO has introduced some noise, and that's not a good thing necessarily. If you wanted to make a poster or a large image of some size, then you would want to shoot at a lower ISO. But sometimes you don't have that choice. If you're shooting a basketball game, you're going to have your ISO cranked up. 1600 may not be enough. Now, the more sophisticated single lens reflex cameras can go way up. My camera goes to 64,000 ISO. Now that's going to put in a bit of noise for sure, but sometimes that's all you can get. So you do what you can. Photography is really, in a technical sense, about making choices. So let's look at another element of choice, and that's aperture. Aperture is the opening of your lens. So if you remember, we have this scale called f-stop scale, and it's a bit counterintuitive, but that's the way it is. the lower the f-stop, so here's f4 for example, then that means the greater the opening of the lens is. So this lens is set wider. Now the consequence of that is significant, and where it comes into play is with this concept of depth of field, what shows up in focus. So if we look at this lamp post that Destiny Maynard sent, this is the light, and you can see this base is actually falling off a little bit in terms of focus. It's a little fuzzy. The background is very fuzzy, f4. Now let's move on to f16. Now in this one, the base is pretty much all sharp, all in focus, and the background is not as blurred out. If we go to the f32, you can see the background becomes even more in focus. It's still out of focus, but it's more in focus than with the first one. Look at the first one, f4, f32. So what you're doing with your aperture is you're controlling the depth of field, what is in focus, and you do that by controlling the f-stop. f32 is a very small hole. That means in order to get enough light in there, you're going to either have to have the shutter open longer, or you're going to have your ISO cranked up, or both. So this is your choice, aperture. Let's look at another one. On the second part of this assignment, guys, you didn't do it great. I'm sorry. It's probably my fault for not really explaining it. It's a difficult concept. But here's the way it works. Here's your small hole, large f-stop. Look at the tape measure. Look how much of it is in focus. And then as we go through the f-stops, opening the aperture is the hole, where we get over here to f1.4, and that is about as wide open as you're going to get on a single lens reflex camera lens. So what happens? Even the area that was in focus throughout all of these different iterations of this is pretty well out of focus. It's almost difficult to focus sometimes when you have it this wide open. But when you see the distance of going towards the back, then that is where you're going to have some control. And you guys set up some things, but you didn't really change the aperture. Some of you changed the ISO. Some of you actually set up two completely different things. I really just wanted one thing. Let's look at another example, and that's this piano. I probably should have told you to think about a piano, and you can see with this piano that there's a part of this that is in focus and the rest of it is not, including the foreground. So this photographer decided this was the area that was going to be in focus. Now, if you used a larger opening, you have less in focus. The low f-stop, less in focus. If you'd used a higher f-stop number, smaller hole, then you would have more in focus. This is a choice that photographers make. What will be in focus? Let's look at another piano example. And different piano, different positioning, but this area, kind of on this diagonal here, from up here on this down through these keys right in here, are the only parts that are truly in focus. So that's the point of aperture, is to control the light, yes, but at the same time you're controlling what will be in focus. Let's turn to shutter speed. Now, shutter speed means how long your camera is going to be open So the light that's coming through your lens and hitting the receptor will be determined by how long the shutter is open. So when you have a moving object, like a car on the road, vehicle on the road here, and you're shooting at a quarter of a second, and the vehicle is moving along pretty quick, you're not going to see a very defined image of the vehicle. It's whizzing by here. So let's try to use a little faster shutter speed. By the way, this is Allison's. So here's a car. It's going the other way. Doesn't really matter which direction it's going. But 1/30th of a second, well, we can see that it's actually a vehicle. We can see it's a truck here. But it's still moving. It's blurred. Now note that the background is not blurred. Okay? So this is an effect. Sometimes you might want this. It does kind of give the idea of some speed. Let's make the shutter speed even faster. 500th of a second. 500th of a second is pretty fast, and it's going to stop the action. So this car, which was going along the road, looks like it's parked there because the shutter speed was so fast that it froze the action. So you can see the background here, all still in focus, but the car is not only in focus, but it's not blurred from movement. So there's another example from Megan Phillips, who used a ceiling fan. So at 1/4 of a second, those ceiling fan blades are going so fast you really can't even see them. But if we make that shutter go a little quicker, 1/30th of a second, now we can see that there are blades, but we can also see those blades are moving. And then if we go even faster, 1/250th of a second, the blades are pretty much stopped. So shutter speed is another factor for light, but it's also a factor for stopping action. There was a second image I asked you to shoot and use two very different shutter speeds. So here's the shutter speed of this beach ocean at 1/1600th of a second. Pretty fast shutter. And it really freezes the action. You can see that all of this water here is just frozen in place because the shutter was opened so quickly. What happens when we slow the shutter down to 1/15th of a second? It blurs the action. So sometimes you want to stop the action. Sometimes you want to blur the action. Waterfalls are classics for this kind of blurred motion, but if you're shooting a sports event, you may want to freeze the action. How do you control? You control with shutter speed. But remember, the relationship between ISO, aperture, and shutter speed means that if you change this, you're going to have to do something with the ISO and with the shutter speed and with the aperture. All of these three things work together, and when you learn how to control those, you've really moved ahead as a photographer. The last one I asked you to do was simply to have a subject move past you and to take a photograph where you swing the camera in the direction that the subject is going. Destiny submitted this one, and it's pretty good, but it would have been better if the subject was actually up here, if you're 90 degrees from the subject. In other words, perpendicular. If you draw a line from your camera to the subject and they're perpendicular, then that's easier to do. If it's lagging behind, it doesn't show as well. Here's Landon Brooks, and he got this truck and panned with it. The truck is just slightly blurred, and a lot of this is just the movement of the camera itself. It's really challenging to hold the camera still when you're doing a lot of photography. It's one of the reasons that professional photographers use a tripod, is just to take that away. And you can pan with a subject on a tripod, and it'll hold the camera nice and steady. And then this is one I found, and so this is a real good example. The camera was panning with the subject, and what that does is it freezes the subject here, but it creates these motion lines because that's the background there, and your camera is actually moving and creating that, but the subject is nicely sharp and crisp. So that's a great trick, really, to learn how to do. And you can do all of these things by practicing, and you can do that outside of this assignment. And one of the things I strongly recommend is that you keep a notebook, and when you shoot different things, write down what you're trying to do. Write down your camera settings. What ISO were you using? What shutter speed were you using? What lens were you using? And what was your aperture, your f-stop? If you can kind of keep a notebook like that, you might even put in like lighting conditions, like partly cloudy or low light for getting towards the afternoon or maybe early in the morning. Things like that. They'll just help you be a better photographer. All right, so here's the good news for you. We're going to take photographs from now on without a whole lot of the technical stuff. The reason that you get the full credit for your assignments up till now, as I said earlier, was because we have so many different camera situations. We have people taking exclusively with cell phone cameras, we have some sophisticated SLR cameras, and we have everything in between. So you turned in the work, you got the points. But from here on out, you'll be graded. So what are you going to be graded on? Well, number one is if you're following the instructions. If you're asked to submit 12 photographs, submit 12 photographs. Follow the instructions, follow, and you know, it's really a matter of just paying attention to what is required and submitting what is required. The other thing is to include your shooting information. I would also encourage you to please, when you're creating your slides, your PowerPoint slides or Google Slides, whatever you're using, try to put the image as large as you can on there. I know if it's a vertical, it's not going to be across, but you can make it top to bottom, and then put the technical information over on the side. If you have a horizontal, just have a little space down at the bottom, and you can put the technical information in down there for me, and that would be great. But the larger the picture is, the easier it is for me to see. Now, the other thing I want you to do is to make time to do this. This is a simple class in the sense that you don't have to buy a textbook. The readings are brief. They're mostly blog posts. The videos are mostly short. So you need to spend your time with the camera outside taking the photographs and doing the best job you can. Probably you want to go out and shoot several times for each exercise. And you can do that when you can take advantage of some nice weather. So that's pretty much it for your assignment number 5 feedback. And you're moving on to the next assignment where you're going to be shooting landscapes and action shots, and I think you'll have fun with that. Try to apply what you've learned in a technical sense to your photography from now on. If you have any questions, please let me know.